We are beginning a new series today called Living a Great Story. We all love a great story, don't we? I mean, just look at what happened with Star Wars over the last couple weeks. I mean, what an amazing thing. Star Wars is this kind of like epic cultural story that has been told my entire life. I remember I was 9 years old when the first episode came out. It was kind of formative as I was growing up, those stories. And it's amazing to think that now, almost 40 years later, those stories are still being told and that our children have an opportunity to kind of hear these stories or live them out in some way. But episode 7 of this story opened on December 18, and it pretty much broke every record of like any movie ever set. Hit $1 billion in the first 12 days in ticket sales. I mean, that's a lot of tickets. $1 billion in 12 days. This is news to you. Actually, if you want to go to, there's a Wikipedia site that's set up that just lists all of the records that this movie, this story has broken, and it would take quite a long time to be able to read all the records it's broken in just the first 2 weeks. We all love a great story, evidenced by the Star Wars and $1 billion in 12 days. But what is it that makes a great story? What is it that draws us in and captivates our attention? What is it that steals our heart and makes us fall in love with a character? Well, according to Donald Miller, he wrote a book called A Million Miles in 1,000 Years, and he talks about what makes a great story, and he says there's really 4 essential parts in any great story. If you're missing one of those 4 parts, you've got a stinker of a story. And so what I'd like to do is just kind of unpack those 4, because we're going to be setting this series up. We're going to be in this series for the next 8 or 9 weeks. And so I kind of like to just set up what makes a great story so we can kind of look at the story we're going to be looking at through this lens. And I hope you don't mind if I use Star Wars as an example. Maybe you love Star Wars, maybe you hate Star Wars, but I'm going to use this as an example to kind of give you the parts of a great story. And don't worry, if you haven't seen it yet, I will be very careful not to give any spoilers. Okay? But what makes a great story? The first thing that makes a great story, the first essential ingredient is a great story, is you have to have a great protagonist. A protagonist is like the main character of the story. And the point isn't to have a protagonist, because pretty much every story has one, but they have to be a good protagonist. They have to be a likable protagonist, someone that you want to root for, someone that you feel a connection with, someone that you identify with and you get invested in, and you get drawn into their character, and you just want them to win. Right? This is so very important in a story, to have a good, likable, lovable protagonist. And I would say for Star Wars, finally, after six episodes, they got this right, if you've seen it. Because if you've watched the first 6 episodes, George Lucas wasn't the best at developing characters, in my opinion. You had characters like Luke Skywalker and Princess Amidala and Anakin Skywalker and Princess Leia, and they were all good characters. They just weren't great characters. They weren't characters that you'd really identify with. You didn't really root for them. Sometimes they're just whiny. Sometimes they just didn't have much personality. Other times their characters just weren't developed very well. But now all of a sudden Disney gets involved with Star Wars, and they know how to develop a character. And now for the first time, I believe, in my opinion, for Star Wars, they are developing characters really well, and they have their best characters ever in episode 7. Particularly, there's a character, the main protagonist of the movie is named Rey. Rey is the main protagonist of the story, and she may be the best character Star Wars has ever created, and I believe that's one of the reasons this movie is breaking so many records, is because from the very beginning, this is someone you can identify with. This is a person who goes through hardship and continually faces adversity with hope. She's competent, she's likable, she welcomes adventure. I mean, halfway through the movie, you want her to win. You are totally invested in this character. You want her to succeed. You're cheering for her. And this is the first ingredient of a great story. You gotta have a great protagonist. Remember that. All right? What's the second ingredient of a great story? Well, the second ingredient of a great story is a noble ambition. The great character can't just be likable. They have to have a noble ambition. They have to want to accomplish something bigger than themselves. Maybe they see a problem in the world. They want to make a difference in that problem in the world. Maybe it's they see a problem in themselves. They want to overcome that. There's something in the community. It's someone who's lonely that they want to meet somebody. There's got to be some noble ambition. And again, without any spoilers for Star Wars, if you haven't seen it yet, I could tell you probably safely that the fate of the galaxy is in jeopardy, right? Okay? If this ragtag band of misfits don't step up and courageously do something, the evil empire will win, the rebellion will be squashed, the dark side will come out on top. So a great story needs a noble ambition, and Star Wars certainly has the noble ambition. The third thing a great story needs conflict. This is so very, very important. In other words, the protagonist, in their attempt or their pursuit to gain their noble ambition, it can't come easy. They have to go through conflict. They have to go through obstacles. They have to hit hardship and difficulty. Otherwise, you have a boring story. If what I want comes easy to me, nobody wants to see that. Nobody wants to read that. And we need to remember that in life. This is so very important as we're trying to live a good story, is that good stories only come through conflict. Think about this through the lens of Star Wars. I mean, just think about Star Wars without conflict. Star Wars, if the light side just defeated the dark side with no effort whatsoever. That wouldn't be much of a story, would it? I mean, what if in episode 1, young Anakin Skywalker joined the pod race, and from the very beginning he was leading, and there's never a doubt he was going to win, and at the end he did win, just like we knew he would. That wouldn't be exciting. Or what if in episode 4, when the Death Star had to be blown up, what if there was a target on the side of the Death Star the size of a small moon? And as Luke Skywalker went in his TIE fighter, or his X-Wing fighter to blow up the Death Star, no TIE fighters came out to oppose him. He just flew right up and blew it up. That wouldn't be a good story. No, he's got to fly through that canyon with people shooting at him. You're wondering, why does he have to fly through that canyon for so long? Why can't he just go in at the very end? But no, he's got to go through it for a long time because he needs conflict. And then the target he has to shoot for, it can only be like a few feet wide, and it's got to be like against all odds. And that makes a great story. And the same is true. Again, we need to remember this in our lives, that conflict makes a great story. If things come easy for people, that's not the making of something that's interesting. Those who are watching the story, they want to see themselves, or they want to see the protagonist overcome obstacles. They want to see how deep they will dig in order to accomplish their noble, grand ambition. There has to be conflict to have a great story. And finally, there needs to be resolution of some kind. All of us have probably read that book or seen that movie or heard that story where you just get to the end and you're like, so what happens? And you're like, that's like maddening. No, I've got to know what happens. There needs to be resolution in order to have a good story. And in Star Wars, if you've seen any of the episodes, usually the end of the story will be 80% resolution and 20% will remain open-ended because they want you to see the next episode. And we're okay with that, we get that, but there needs to be resolution of some kind in the story for it to be a good story. The guy gets the girl. The good guy wins the battle. The universe is saved from certain doom and the dark side. Whatever, you get the point. There needs to be resolution in a good story. So these are the 4 main parts of a great story. You've got a protagonist that you can root for, who has a noble ambition to do something bigger than themselves, but who encounters tremendous conflict in the pursuit of that noble ambition, yet in the end experiences resolution. So today we're going to begin this new series, and we're going to be looking at what I believe is a great story. The story of a man who lived about 2,500 years ago named Nehemiah. And what we're going to find is that Nehemiah lived a great story. He was a protagonist, I believe, you'll be rooting for by the time we get through the story. He has this noble ambition, and he encounters tremendous conflict in order to get at his noble ambition. And in the end, we're going to see that he experiences a lot of resolution. And as we go through this journey together through the book of Nehemiah, not only are we going to be looking at his story through the lens of these 4 parts of what makes a good story, but I'm going to be asking you, are you living a good story? I mean, if your life right now were being written as a novel or made into a movie, would you want to watch it? Would you be the kind of protagonist that people can root for? Do you have a noble ambition in your life, something bigger than you that you're living for? What are you willing to go through in order to see that accomplished in your life? What hardship, what conflict, what difficulty are you willing to go through to accomplish that noble ambition? And finally, how will your life ultimately resolve. Let's get to Nehemiah's story. In order to understand Nehemiah's story, we have to understand the story of his people. And about 1,500 years before Nehemiah was born, his story really starts with God approaching a man by the name of Abraham in the year 2000 BC. And God made a series of promises to Abraham that Abraham, through his descendants, was going to become a great nation, and that God would give this great nation, these many people, a land of their own. And sure enough, through lots of conflict and against all odds, Abraham has a son, and his son has sons, and their sons have sons. And Abraham, several generations later, has more kids than he can count. They become a great nation. And about several hundred years later, God actually gives them a land of their own, Canaan. And it was about 1,000 years after Abraham that they established their first capital, Jerusalem. And Jerusalem became a place where they built their own city and their own culture, where they built the temple that all Jews were so proud of. It was a place where they could worship the God who kept promises to his people and to their father Abraham. But God's people weren't always as faithful to God as God was to them. They continually rebelled against him in unimaginable ways. And over the course of hundreds of years, God continually came to his people and warned them through prophets that if you continue in your rebellion, then my blessing is going to be withdrawn from you and your people and your city of Jerusalem. And I'm going to allow an invading army to come in and invade your country, destroy your city, and they'll carry any survivors off into exile to live in a foreign land that is not your own, and you will live as strangers in a strange land. So, sure enough, after hundreds of years of warning, an army from Babylon came down, invaded Israel, destroyed Jerusalem, flattened the walls, flattened the temple. Jerusalem was a pile of rubble. Anyone who lived through that was carried off to Babylon to live in exile. The people lost their land. But even during this time, God speaks through a prophet by the name of Jeremiah that their time in exile will only be 70 years. That after 70 years, God said that in his mercy, he was going to allow the people to return to Jerusalem, to rebuild the city, to rebuild the temple, and start all over again and do it all over again. And sure enough, after 70 years, Babylon was overtaken by the Persian Empire. A new king by the name of Cyrus takes the throne of the Persian Empire. And in fulfillment of the prophecies of Jeremiah, right on time, 70 years later, Cyrus allows the first wave of Israelites to go back to Jerusalem to begin rebuilding. This is what many scholars call the second Exodus. The first Exodus was when the Hebrews left Egypt under Moses. Now the second Exodus is taking place out of Babylon and out of Persia. They're going back to Israel. They actually go in about 3 waves. The first wave in about 537 BC under Zerubbabel. And we read about Ezra, a guy who wrote a book of the Bible, in about 460 BC. He leads another wave, and we'll read about the third wave in the book of Nehemiah. But they go back and they start to build, and this is what brings us to the story. Let's meet our protagonist, Nehemiah. Who is Nehemiah? What kind of guy is he? What kind of protagonist is he? Is he someone that we could identify with? Is he someone that we're going to like? Is he someone that we're going to be rooting for by the end of the story? Well, to set the scene, we find ourselves in a very unexpected place to tell the story of a Jewish man living in the 5th century BC. We find ourselves in the palace of the king of Persia, the most powerful man on the planet at the time. And this is where we find the story of Nehemiah getting started. Look at Nehemiah chapter 1, beginning in verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, son of Hakaliah. We don't know anything about Hakaliah other than he had a son by the name of Nehemiah. It says, in the month of Kislev, in the 20th year, while I was in the citadel of Susa. So it sounds like Nehemiah is writing the story. This is a first-person narrative for the most part. And we're told the setting here is the month of Kislev, which would have been December, so it's winter time, in the 20th year of the reign of Artaxerxes. Now, we know that Artaxerxes reigned. We know when he reigned, and so we could pinpoint this is about 445 BC, so about 2,400 years ago. This is taking place in the citadel or the palace of Susa. Susa is the capital of the Persian Empire. So here we find Nehemiah writing about his story in the middle of the palace of the most powerful man on the planet. what is he doing there? Well, at the end of chapter 1, Nehemiah tells us why he's there. He is the cupbearer to the king. Now, we may think, well, what does a cupbearer do, or how important is a cupbearer? You may think of a cupbearer being like a servant or a butler or something like that. But in Nehemiah's time, a cupbearer would be a very elevated position to have. A cupbearer would be the person who would drink all of the king's wine before he drank it and eat all the king's food before he ate it. In case someone was trying to poison the king, the cupbearer would eat or drink it first, and so there would be no more cupbearer, but long live the king, right? And so because of this, there would be a very intimate relationship that would be established between the cupbearer and the king. The cupbearer would have the king's ear many times. He'd be able to talk about who should maybe take this royal position or that royal position, or give him news of what's happening in the kingdom. There would be this intimacy that would develop between the king and the cupbearer, because the cupbearer was laying his life on the line every day and every meal for the king. And this is what Nehemiah does. He is cupbearer to the king. Let's continue. Verse 2. Now we're going to see the events that start our story. Our context has been set. We know where we are. We know who we're dealing with. What event starts the story? Verse 2. Hanani, one of my brothers, we believe this is one of his actual biological brothers, came from Judah. That's where Jerusalem would have been, about 800 miles away from the Persian capital. So he had been 800 miles away with some friends visiting Jerusalem. He came from Judah with some other men, and I questioned them about the Jewish remnant that survived the exile and also about Jerusalem. So here is Nehemiah. He's separated from Jerusalem, his homeland, and his people by 800 miles. He's working for this king, but his brother had recently been on a business trip or something to Jerusalem. He's just come back, and Nehemiah has questions for his brothers and for the men who are with him. And you could tell a lot about Nehemiah just by the questions that he asks. He could have asked, how was your trip? Did you see so-and-so? Did you pick me up a dozen of Moe's bagels from that Jerusalem deli that I love so much? He could have asked any number of questions, but instead he asked two questions. Number one, how are the people? How are the people getting along? And number two, how is our city? How is the city of our people? Nehemiah has a heart for his people. He has a heart for his city. And in response, his brother is going to give him some really bad news. He says in verse 3, they said to me, those who survived the exile and are back in the province are in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates have been burned with fire. So things aren't going well in Jerusalem. The people are in trouble, and they're in disgrace. Why? Because the walls of the city still haven't been rebuilt. They're in piles of rubble. There are no gates to the city whatsoever. Why would that be a problem? Well, first of all, this would bring disgrace on a city, because in that day, a city without walls isn't worth being called a city. That would be like today, a city without an Indian restaurant. That's like a disgrace to all cities. It wasn't until Parker finally got an Indian restaurant that we felt like this was home, okay? You got to have walls to be called a city. But more than that, the people would be in trouble because they didn't have walls, because they would be completely vulnerable to attack from their enemies and the surrounding countries. And what we're going to see in Nehemiah is that the people in Jerusalem have many enemies, people who want to do them harm. And so they would need walls in order to protect themselves. But they don't have those walls. Even though the people had returned some 80 years before, they had been there for 80 years by the time the story of Nehemiah is told, they still haven't, for whatever reason, they haven't been able to rebuild the walls. They're still lying in heaps of rubble, and therefore the people are disgraced and they're in trouble. So, again, we ask ourselves the question, who is this Nehemiah guy? What kind of protagonist is he? Do we like him? Will we root for him? Well, we get one of our first kind of clues into what kind of man Nehemiah is by how he responds to bad news. You can tell a lot about a person by how they respond to bad news. If you read a book, if you watch a movie, you often tell once the protagonist character has been set up, all of a sudden bad news will come. And we want to see, how do they deal with it? Do they collapse? Do they point the finger at somebody else? Do they rise to the challenge? How does someone respond to bad news? You can tell a lot about a person by how they respond to bad news. Because I'll tell you what, in our lives, bad news is something we can all expect. Whether it's you find out that your company has downsized and your job is no longer available and you're out of a job, or the person that you've been dating for months or years decides that they just want to be friends now, and you get that bad news, or your car has broken down, your car needs a new engine kind of bad news, or you hear about the kind of bad news where a natural disaster has just killed this huge number of people, or a war that has displaced millions of people. I mean, how do you deal with bad news? Bad news is sure to come. Sitting in this room right now, I've talked to at least 3 people who have lost close loved ones in the last week. There's lots of bad news right here in this room. Bad medical diagnoses, waiting on test results. And bad news is one of the things that we're guaranteed of in life. So how do we deal with bad news? Well, there are several less than attractive options on how to deal with bad news. Let me share a couple of these with you, all of which I'm guilty of from time to time. But the first bad way to deal with bad news is with apathy. This happens a lot when maybe it doesn't affect me directly, but maybe somebody I know or someone far away. We could deal with apathy. Apathy says, you know what, that doesn't affect me that much. I really don't care that much about this particular bad news. It doesn't affect me. And Nehemiah could have responded to the news from Jerusalem with apathy. We would understand that completely. You could say, that doesn't affect me. It's too bad for them. I'm glad I didn't go back to Jerusalem. I'm glad I'm here in Susa. I'm glad I have this great job. I'm glad I work for the king. Good for me, bad for them. I'm sorry for them. But you know what? There's nothing really I can do about it. That would be apathy. And apathy is not really the beginning of a great story. Blame is another way that we can handle bad news. When we get news that maybe there's a problem related to us, we could just say the problem is not with me, it's with someone else. It's not my fault, therefore I have no responsibility. When we get bad news, it's basically justifying ourselves from having to do something because the problem isn't mine. It's not because of me. Again, Nehemiah could respond to this bad news with blame. He could blame the people of Israel and Jerusalem for not rebuilding the wall. They've been there 80 years. Why don't they rebuild it? It's on them. He could blame the surrounding people. Well, maybe it's because they won't let them build the wall. He could blame conditions. They don't have the right building materials. They don't have a Home Depot or a Lowe's in Jerusalem yet to be able to build. He could blame the king. He could blame God. God, why don't you help them? Why haven't you done something? And any of those excuses would have made Nehemiah feel good about doing nothing to fix the problem, because the problem isn't with him, the problem is out here. Blame is a bad way to respond to bad news, and it's not the beginning of a good story. Or how about this? Self-pity. Self-pity is another way to respond to bad news. We just feel sorry for ourselves. We try to get as many other people around us to feel sorry for us. Let me tell you my sob story. Let me tell you what has happened to me. And once you hear what has happened to me, you're going to feel as sorry for me as I feel for me. Can you believe what they did to me? Can you believe what happened to me? Can you see why I can't do anything about this? Can you understand why I'm going to sit right here and cry my tears and have a pity party? Now, certainly there are things that happen to us where the appropriate response is grief. Grief is a healthy emotion where we let go of something that we have lost, and we process that, and tears are necessary for that. But self-pity is something altogether. It is an egocentric response to bad news where I put myself at the very middle of things, and I keep myself at the middle of things, and I ask everyone else to keep me at the middle of it as well. And Nehemiah could respond with self-pity. He said, now what am I going to do? Now I can never go home. All I've ever wanted was to go to Jerusalem. Now I can't go because these people won't build the wall. Can you see why you should feel bad for me? I don't deserve this. Or one final inappropriate way to respond to bad news is to respond to bad news with fear and hopelessness. Some people, when they get bad news, they go right to the very worst outcome possible. Whenever there's difficulty, whenever there's obstacles, I just think of the worst possible thing that could possibly happen to me, and we're filled with fear and we lose hope. And Nehemiah could respond this way. It's been 80 years, we still don't have walls. We're never going to get walls. What's going to happen to our people? Will our city survive this? We're doomed. It's a way to respond to bad news, but it's not the beginning of a good story. None of these 4 ways are a good way to live a good story. They don't make a great protagonist. When you find somebody getting bad news and they respond to one of these in one of these ways, apathy, blame, self-pity, fear, hopelessness, is that something that endears you to a person? Is it something that inspires the best in you when you see someone responding to bad news in this way? No, these responses certainly don't inspire us, nor do they endear us to a person or to our hearts. And so it doesn't make a great protagonist. So how does our protagonist, Nehemiah, respond to this really bad news that comes through his brother from Jerusalem? Verse 4. When I heard these things, I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. You may say, well, that sounds like self-pity. No, we're going to see anything but self-pity in Nehemiah. He is mourning, he is grieving, he is fasting, he's doing without food. But what we see here is the opposite of apathy. He hears this news from so far away, he could just write it off, but rather than have apathy, Nehemiah responds with compassion. Compassion is a great way that great protagonists often respond to bad news, especially that which isn't right in front of them. Compassion. Nehemiah responds with care. He feels for the people who are going through such difficult circumstances so far away. He cares about the reputation of God and his city in Jerusalem. Compassion is a so much better story than apathy. Just think about what we did last month as we considered what was happening so far away in our world in Syria. You know, we talked about what was happening in Syria, 12 million refugees, half of those being kids. We could very easily respond with apathy to that problem. It's so far away. It's not our problem. We have much bigger problems, much closer to home. I've got my own problems. They'll have to deal with it. They're going to have to work that out. But rather than respond with apathy, this church responded with compassion. We said, we may not be able to do everything, but we could do something. And so we're going to give what we can to help even a few people, if that's all we can help. But if we're going to alleviate the suffering of a few people, we think that's a much better story, doing something, than to do nothing and to say there's nothing we can do. Apathy or compassion. Nehemiah chooses to respond first and foremost with compassion. He feels the pain of those who are suffering. Second, we see Nehemiah chooses to respond to bad news and difficulty with faith. Rather than lose all hope, rather than turn totally to fear, he turns to prayer. And the rest of chapter 1 is this prayer that Nehemiah prays, and we can learn so much about what kind of man he is, what kind of protagonist he is in our story by the things that he prays for. Look at verse 5. He says this, "Then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God." He's able to say, even though your city is lying in ruins, even though the walls are still torn down and the gates are burned with fire, I still acknowledge you are good. And that could be the first step that sometimes we need to take in the midst of bad news. Even though my life is falling apart, even though bad things are happening to me, even though circumstances are out of my control, I can acknowledge God is good. Right? O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of God. In other words, I'm praying to you. I know other people are praying to you. We're joining our prayers together. God, I believe that you hear. I have faith that you hear, and I believe that by praying and by you hearing, you're going to do something. You're going to do something that you wouldn't have done otherwise had we not prayed. So Nehemiah responds to bad news with faith, with hope. God will do something. I will talk to him. This is the beginning of a good story. Knee-jerk reaction. Bad news, let's pray. Let's trust God. Next, Nehemiah responds to bad news by taking personal responsibility. Now, this is one of the things that inspires me in people when I see it more than anything else. Someone who's willing to say, you know what? Here's my part of the problem. Here is what I have contributed to this issue. You know, even when people, you can't even think that they would have anything whatsoever to blame, they'll still say, well, here's my part of it. That just endears us to a person, draws us in. This is something. This is what Nehemiah does. Look at all the we words he uses here. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. In other words, we're in this situation because of our own fault. It's because of our sin. We have acted very wickedly toward you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. So right there, Nehemiah, again, he could have said, I'm here in Susa, man. I'm working for the king, right? But instead he says, no, it's my father, it's my ancestors, and it's me. We rebelled against God. It's the reason we are in the predicament we're in. I'm to blame. He could have blamed God for the predicament the people are in, but he wisely knows, no, God was really patient with our people for hundreds of years. It's our fault. He could have blamed the other people. He could have blamed his ancestors. But instead, he takes personal responsibility. He owns his contribution to the problem. And that is something. It's a sign of a great person, and I believe a person who's living a great story. As we kind of return to Nehemiah's prayer, he comes back to this idea of faith as he reminds God about promises he's made in the past. He says, remember the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, and whenever you tell God to remember something, remember whose sake that's for. It's for my sake, right? Not God's sake. But remember, God, the instruction you gave your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. And that's exactly what had happened. Nehemiah is saying, you said that was going to happen. If we're unfaithful to you, you're going to scatter us. It's happened. You kept that promise. But, he goes on, and he says, if you return to me and obey my commands, and even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. So he's reminding them of this promise he made. Yeah, you said you're going to scatter us, but you said if ever we return to you, that you would draw us together again into a city, that you would give us a chance to rebuild. So now, God, won't you do what you said you will do? And so finally, we see Nehemiah, after all this prayer, he's going to come to the end of his prayer, and we see he has a plan, not just to pray, but he's a plan to be a part of the solution. He wants to do something. And that is a wonderful attribute of someone living a great story, someone who will do something to make things better. Oh Lord, he prays, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant, that's me, success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man. Who's this man? The king. Very next line says, I was cupbearer to the king. Nehemiah has a plan. After days of fasting, after days of mourning, after days of praying, God has inspired him with a plan to do more than pray. He believes that he should and can use his connection to the king to advance the condition of his people. He wants to be a part of the solution, so he asks God to go before him and give him favor in the eyes of the king. God, give me favor in the eyes of the king. Wow. So as we begin to kind of just get to know Nehemiah here, as we just go through the first chapter of his story, what do you learn about him in this first chapter that gives you an impression of who he is? Would you consider him to be a likable guy? Is he someone that you'd want to spend time with? Maybe someone you'd like to be more like? Someone that you think that you could root for as he kind of pursues his plan to talk to the king? Is he someone that you would say has the makings of living a good or a great story? And from my perspective, Nehemiah is a good guy. He's humble. He loves his people. He's faithful to God. He deals really well with bad news. I mean, look at what he does. Instead of responding with apathy, Nehemiah is moved by compassion. That's a good story. Instead of blaming other people, Nehemiah takes personal responsibility for the predicament he finds he and his people in. Instead of fear and hopelessness, Nehemiah responds in faith. He prays to God. He believes that God will do something. He has hope. And rather than self-pity, Nehemiah has a plan, and he is going to do something. He is going to do something because he can do something. You can tell a lot about a person based on how they handle bad news. You can tell a lot about whether someone is living a good story, whether they are a good protagonist, based on how they deal with difficulty. So let's talk about your story. What kind of protagonist would you be? What kind of story are you living? you responding to bad news with apathy? This is one of the ways we could tell what kind of protagonist we are. What do we do with difficulty? What do we do with hardship? Is it apathy? Is it blame? Is it fear, hopelessness, self-pity? Or is it compassion, personal responsibility, faith in God, the desire to do something? This week, I just love to ask you to reflect on this question. If my life were being written as a novel, if a camera was following me around, telling the story of my life, what kind of protagonist would I be based on how I deal with bad news? Or what kind of difficulty are you facing right now where you can say, I want to deal with this, I want to respond to this in the right way. I want to be compassionate when other people are suffering. I want to take personal responsibility when at all possible to do so. I want to exhibit faith in all things, never losing hope, never being controlled by fear. And when I have the ability to do something, I want to do it. I want to use the resources I have available to me to alleviate the suffering of others and to make the situation better. Next week, we're going to be continuing on to chapter 2. And we're going to be looking at the second part of what makes a great story, and we're going to learn about Nehemiah's noble ambition. If you'd like to read ahead, we'll be in Nehemiah chapter 2. I'd encourage you to do so, but I hope you'll be with us as we continue to see what it looks like to live a great story.